So I think yesterday I talked about one of the first forms of torture or technology that was used aside from what was done to my son when he was still in the womb. I talked about how he and I began vomiting, and that very strange situation where we were targeted with something, and how other individuals were showing up in the emergency room. There weren't a whole lot. It wasn't like a whole group rushed into the waiting room and the waiting rooms were full. But once we were back into the emergency room, there were people that were there ahead of us, and I could hear them vomiting. And it sounded like the exact same thing that yes, people can go to the emergency room and be sick for other reasons. I realized that, but I had an intuitive feeling that something was happening besides that to a few people. So it was anywhere from maybe 6 individuals there in the emergency room who were all ill the way that my son and I were. And what they gave me was, they told me to take these very high dose. Their treatment for me was to have me take extremely high dose iodine, very, very, very high iodine / potassium pills, or not potassium, I think I said yesterday something about potassium, maybe by mistake. I said something about iodine and then potassium. I said whatever it is that you take for radiation treatments or to prevent radiation from being absorbed into your glands and thyroid especially. And I think potassium wasn't, they didn't give me potassium. What I meant is that they gave me extremely high doses of iodine. And I'm not sure why they would give me such, I'm not sure why they give me such high levels of it. But they told me to take these 2 large pills while they were standing there, which I did. And then I later thought about it and thought it was, why would they treat me with something like that? And as I say, my son was taken out of the room away from me because I was so sick, and I really regret that. He wasn't able to speak normally after that, as I've already said. So I was going to then describe the next thing that occurred to both me and my son at our house, because then we were both being assaulted, not just me but my son, on an every single night basis. And before I go into that, I want to fill in a few of the gaps, just a couple of small things about other individuals that that I had come across, or that might stand out in a small way before which I haven't mentioned yet. And I think that there are a lot of things that I'm sure I'm missing, but just in case something matters. One of the things that I did forget to mention is that when I went to counseling, this really has nothing to do with the torture, so I'm kind of breaking away from that, and then I'll come back to it. Just has more to do with people that I was meeting, and records that were being withheld from me, people I met who were connected to NASA or to military, that kind of thing. So after I was with this, I did talk about how I had a boyfriend. It was very short term. I mean, it was sort of a boyfriend. And I broke the relationship off because it was something that I kind of went into in shock after I was raped. When I was raped when I was 24, of my virginity. And I already talked about how I went to counseling for that. Well, when I went to counseling, I asked for the records later, and they refused to give me my records. And I've never had those records to this day, and I remember that I was really shocked because the man in charge of the place, I think that he was a Protestant in some way, and I remember he was connected to military. And he was the head of the entire psychological department. It was, I don't remember exactly. I'd have to look it up again because I have it written down and I've looked at it many times. I can identify the building and the name once I see it online. I think it was Western Psychological, maybe. It was a place that I was able to go to on insurance. And I went there for 3 months voluntarily. Nobody asked me to go or told me to go. I wanted to go because I needed to get through and process this rape that had happened. And so I suppose aside from telling I guess aside from telling a bunch of pastors what had happened to me right within the same week that this rape occurred by Josh Gatoff, and aside from then maybe 2 months or 3 months later going to a doctor and then checking the box for are you a victim of sexual assault, and it was the first time I'd ever had to check the box, but I was being honest, and then they asked and I told them I was raped. That was the first time there was any kind of an official state record that I was claiming that I had been raped. And I was going to the state because I had state insurance at the time. I believe it was through either college insurance or another form of insurance. And so there was that documentation. And then the other documentation was that after I checked the box for the rape, and then a doctor made a note of that I had said that I had been raped. I then, had a lot of anxiety. I was having panic attacks for the first time in my life, which largely went away within a year or so. I didn't have too many. It was really centered around that event and triggered by that event. And I would start having panic attacks sometimes driving to college, or when he would come into the tutoring center when I was there, which is why I quit my job there. But I went to counseling on my own, and I guess that was the other documentation around that time before I'd ever considered going to police a year and a half later from the time I had counseling. So it was, I believe, like as I say, Western Psychological Counseling, I think. I would remember how to get there if I were in a car or driving, because I drove that same route all the time. And they gave me an Asian counselor who was in training, and I had no problem with that. She seemed nice. I thought she seemed smart. And I think that her name was Carol, which was like a very anglicized, like, or Americanized name, because she had a different name. She had an Asian name, I think, but she went by Carol, I believe. And they had me speaking to Carol after I was raped. And I think that her last name was Lee. And I have some friends from high school named the Rasmussens, and they have a daughter whose first name is Carol Lee, and it's all one word. But I'm not confusing Carol Lee Rasmussen with this Carol Lee counselor. It was, I'm very sure that her first name was Carol, and I thought it was Lee. It was the last name, which is also an Asian last name. But I'm not sure. And my counseling with her was fine, but then towards the end, then she said that she had to review everything with her supervisor. And I really felt that I had processed everything that I needed to talk about, and I thought she did a good job of helping facilitate that and allowing me to speak. And I was crying all the time. Every single time that I went to see her, I was crying. I was sobbing. And she asked if I was depressed, and I said, no, I'm not depressed, and I wasn't. I was not depressed. I was crying because when I had to recount and revisit that situation, of course I would cry. But, somebody can cry and have a reaction and a very normal response to an event that occurred, and yet not be a depressed person in general overall. I mean, right? Is that not true? Because if you could you could be in the best mood and be very very optimistic about life, have nothing wrong with you at all, and then maybe someone brings up your grandmother that you were very close to dying, and how did you felt about it then, and you explain to this person how it affected you, and suddenly you start crying. Well, just because you're crying because you're remembering that event that happened in the past, which makes you sad when you think about it specifically, that doesn't mean that you are sad all the time, all day. And if you have to talk about your grandma and how it affected you day after day in counseling, or for 3 months in counseling, and every time you think about your grandma you're crying, that still doesn't mean that you're depressed. I mean, that's very true, right? You can compartmentalize your emotions. Anyone can, and everyone does, because everybody has had some sort of event that might trigger some kind of an emotional response when you think back on it, or you talk to somebody about it, and it comes up again. And that doesn't necessarily reflect on how you are feeling on an everyday basis. So I really feel that most of any reaction or response I've had has been to traumatic events, has not affected, I think, because I have confidence in myself. I mean, I know that I'm not perfect, but I think that because in general I feel like I am an okay person, and I like myself okay. I think that's why and because I have faith in God, that God feels okay about me in general. I don't I'm not a depressed person. I'm not a person who has I'm not saying that, anybody could be pushed to certain limits, but what has safeguarded me from that is my faith, and in God, and my faith in myself, because I know I have never done anything horribly wrong. And if I've done anything that was a little bit wrong, like everybody does, I've, prayed about it, asked for forgiveness, or resolved it in some way, in a form that feels okay to me. So, I don't get down on myself very easily. I don't let other people's opinions of me or how they treat me, it might cause a reaction, but overall it doesn't make me feel less about myself. I mean, for the most part. And so that's why I wasn't depressed, but she started saying that, and I'm bringing all of that up because I wanted to, because then later I saw a different counselor, who I will mention. And so I saw Carol Lee. This was after I had, these microchip implants in my neck and other places. And it was in 1998, I believe, or 1999. It was in the summer. It was nice weather that I was driving there. So I may have gone to her the following summer